There's no better place, James, than to be in the center of God's will. There's no better place. You could be in Tuktoyaktuk, which is way up on the Arctic coast. You could be there, but if it's the center of God's will, you will be the most satisfied and fulfilled than in whatever, some sweet, I'm like, well, Lord, why couldn't you have called me to Hawaii? That would have been awesome. But if it's not the center of God's will, I would not be satisfied. I would not be content.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. On this podcast, we share stories from church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, a pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or just curious to learn more, our hope is that these conversations inspire you to be a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. If this podcast blesses you, we'd love for you to share episodes and subscribe on your preferred platform. Now, let's dive into our next conversation. Welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for joining us for this episode and this conversation that will hopefully inspire you to be a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. I'm excited for you to hear the conversation today that I had with James Clarence of Cornerstone Church in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. James shares his journey of faith from being a pastor's kid to experiencing a profound encounter with God that led him to ministry. He discusses the challenges he faced in his early ministry career, his transition to Yellowknife, and the importance of prophetic words in guiding his path. James emphasizes the need for revival in Canada and the role of the church in reconciliation with indigenous peoples, highlighting the unique opportunities for ministry in the North. James and his wife, Karina, pastored in Calgary, Alberta at First Assembly for 11 years. They have two daughters, Kendrick and Lennon, and they're about to welcome a son to their family this fall. I think you're going to be blessed by my conversation with James. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with James Clarence. Well, James Clarence, welcome to the Sowers Podcast.
Come on. Honor to be here.
I would love for you, James, to share with us a little bit about how the gospel was sown to you and how you came to know Jesus Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. So my story, I was born and raised in a home of pastors. My parents are church planters. They planted a church in a small town called Devon, Alberta, just outside of Edmonton. And the first time, I gave my life to Jesus was 5 years old at a camp. I'll still remember the exact moment. I was wearing a Canadian tuxedo, denim on denim, and went up to the front, came back, told my parents that night that I gave my life to Jesus. And it was an amazing experience. But as sometimes pastors' kids go, it's either you're headed either to the pulpit or the prison. And I was headed to the prison first. I definitely fell off the tracks, to say the least, just desperate for friends, wanted to fit in, wanted to have community in my small town, that there wasn't a lot of Christians. So I was desperate to do anything to fit in. But then the year I graduated, I got a few prophetic words at another camp about ministry because I was not headed that direction. I wanted to go be a ski instructor. And then God made it clear what he wanted me to do. And then James went back to his same old thing right after that camp, and was at a party and had – this would be, probably one of the more meaningful encounters I've ever had. Because at that time, again, my faith was based purely upon my parents and my friends or the youth group I was at. But I was at this party doing my thing, and I heard God so clearly. It wasn't quite audible, but so clear. James, what do you want? Do you want what I've spoken over you, the life that I have for you, which was ministry, or do you want this? And wrestled for a bit. I'm like, but these are my friends. I was so desperate for friendship, affirmation, all of that. And I'm like, okay, I want you, God. So told my friends, guys, I can't do this anymore. I'm I got to follow God. And they all cussed me out, made fun of me. And I walked home that day, and that would be, for me, the moment I seriously started following Jesus, where the gospel actually permeated my being to the point where I made decisions to say, I'm not turning back anymore, not turning back anymore. So I walked home, head held high, and have never looked back. So, yeah.
And so what were some of the immediate changes in your life and maybe even relationship with your parents? Like, how old were you at the time?
Yeah. So I graduated at 16. Um, the major difference was, again, the people I surrounded myself with. So when I had to say goodbye to my, like, again, childhood friends, I then like immersed myself into a church outside of my town in Edmonton, a church called Bethesda. And I gave all my time that I had to serving there, being involved in community. I just literally had to flip for a season at least. Who was influencing me? Was it my friends at school, or was it the church and getting involved there? And that certainly was the biggest change, where I just started spending all my time at church because I really wanted to take it seriously.
And when did ministry come on the radar for you? I know you mentioned that your parents were both in ministry. Was it connected to your invitation to follow Jesus? Was it separate? When did things kind of come into view as it relates to ministry?
Yeah. So my parents never pressured me. It was literally that camp the year I graduated when I was 16. I was sitting in the back, not paying attention. And the pastor who was preaching called me out of the back, and he had a word of knowledge, didn't know me from Adam. But he called me to the front and was like, this is what you're doing, and listed a bunch of the sin issues I was dealing with, which were all true. He's like, you're settling with your life, but then this is what God wants you to do, which was ministry. So I, again, didn't really believe it in that moment. So literally the same summer, 2 other times, strangers called me out of a service in front of everybody. One said, you have a black heart. The other said, you're making bad decisions. And said, but this is what God wants for you, which was ministry. So it wasn't my parents. It was literally the Lord divinely calling. And of course, I understood ministry, and my grandparents are pastors. Like, it's a bit in the blood, but it definitely is a moment that I wasn't expecting to happen in my life, that God called me to it.
Now, in that first encounter, was it the pastor preacher who identified you as someone at the back? Was that one of the first times that had ever happened to you?
Yeah, the first 100%.
Wow. And so what were you, did he do it in the middle of the whole thing, or was it something that happened afterwards?
In the middle of his sermon, just kind of paused. You in the Yankees hat, get up here. And I like look behind me. I'm like, oh, I guess he's talking to me. And it was, and then kind of kept going on with the service. Like, it was just, it's hard to explain apart from saying it was divine. God intervened in that moment and called me to his work. So, yeah.
And what was, can you remember that moment and just the response of maybe some of your friends that were sitting beside you or anything like that? Like, was it must have felt like, wow, this person just really called me out, and now this is now on display for the people that are around me.
100%. So I think on one hand, I was the guy desperate for affirmation. So I would be the class clown, just overcompensating to get people to like me. So I'm sure on one hand, my friends were like, James, seriously? On another hand, again, the guy led it really well. He got, my friends and some of the camp leadership to come up and pray and affirm the word that God placed on my life. So on the other hand, it was almost like, more than my friends needed to hear it, I needed my friends to hear it, because I was so insecure. So that, okay, if they kind of heard it and then it happened a couple more times that summer with some of the same people in the room, it was almost like, okay, I'm held accountable to that now. If they all heard it, so if I run from this, I'm lying to myself. So it was kind of helpful in that way. That also for me in that moment, it was like, okay, my parents couldn't have set this up. Like, this was the Lord. It was so clear. So I think it was helpful. It was super helpful.
Over the years, have you been part or witness to those sorts of ministry callings or identifications?
Yeah. So yes and no. Yes, in the sense like I'm from a Pentecostal church, Pentecostal background, upbringing, all of that. So that does happen. Uh, Not often, and definitely not as often as it used to. But I've definitely been in services where, okay, somebody else will get a prophetic word or a word of knowledge about somebody and kind of bring them up. Hey, this is what God. But the amount of times it happened to me that summer was pretty rare from what I've seen. So, because again, I just think the Lord had to like almost not force my hand, but just make it so vividly clear. If you don't do this, James, you are lying to yourself. This is what I made you for. So I have certainly seen it to some extent. Somebody else gets a word like that, but not to, that summer for me. And again, it was personal to me. So of course it was very meaningful.
Yeah. So what were some of then the next steps? You've had these experiences in that summer where God made it abundantly clear to you, hey, this is what I've created you for, essentially. So what were some of the next steps and then a couple of your first ministry assignments?
Yeah. So my logical thought was, okay, ministry, I guess I should go to Bible college. So this was a funny moment. I applied to a school my friends were going to in the States and got my visa, this, that, and the other. Again, I graduated a year early because I was getting bullied. So I started homeschooling. And so I hated school. So I wanted to get out and start a new life, to say the least. So got my visa, and then they called a few weeks before school starting, the enrollment kind of faculty, and we're like, hey, thanks for applying. We just feel this is not the right fit for you, at least right now. And I got denied from that school. So then I'm like, okay, Lord must want me to stay in Canada. I applied to a school in Edmonton called Vanguard, which my parents went there. They taught there. I knew all the faculty. They're like super stoked when I called initially and, hey, can you send me the application? Would love. And they also denied me entry, which again was like very puzzling because most Bible colleges accept most people because they just need money. But okay, the Lord called me, but then seemed like a closed door. But hindsight 2020, again, because my faith was built on everybody else, the Lord is getting me alone for a season. After I got denied the second time, I asked, I'm like, well, what do you want me to do now, God? And then the next day, somebody came to my doorstep and offered me a job working for my town's maintenance department, which my role was to paint gas meters in people's backyards so that with a rust coat, so that the pipes wouldn't rust, so that gas wouldn't leak, so that houses wouldn't explode. I was saving lives. But I would spend 8 hours a day by myself. And that's where I learned how to pray. That's where I learned to listen to like podcasts of preaching, like study. That's where I would read my Bible. Like I learned how to have a relationship with just me and the Lord and nobody else. And that was the most meaningful season of my life still to this day. I even moving to Yellowknife, I'm sure we'll get to there, but I my family stayed in Calgary for a couple months and it was me by myself, obviously like the church community, but brand new. And I was in these past few months leaning on lessons I learned in that season of how to rely solely on the Lord, me and God, and I'm okay. So that was definitely a season that I did not anticipate. I was like, oh, sweet, I'm going to go straight to college. But I think the Lord knew if he goes, he'll just, again, build his faith on somebody else, not on our relationship. So then once that finished, the pastor who gave me the first prophetic word about ministry, he was pastoring a church in Calgary. And that church, First Assembly, it was always a church that was doing something, whether it be church planting. And they had planted 8 churches in 3 years right before I got there. Missions, like sending people across the globe, raising up leaders, content, whether it be music or resources or whatever. Like it was always a church that was doing something. So I just prayed. I'm like, Lord, please, like I'll just go serve there. And the goal was to plant a church. Because my parents are church planters, grandparents church planters, and our denomination was planting churches, as well as that church was planting churches. So I'm like, sweet, if I could just go serve, if you could open up a door for me to get involved, Lord willing, they'd plant. So I prayed and prayed and prayed. And then there was this kind of like faith harvest offering where the preacher got up and was like, give above and beyond, and, quoted the whole Malachi scripture, like, test me in this, will I not? So I'm like, all right, I have $100 rebate card that I just got from changing my tires. That was like my food money for a month in college, ramen and whatever, eggs. So I'm like, okay, Lord, I'm going to give this $100, and gave it in the offering. And then a few months later, when I got home, the first conversation I went to this conference called YC in Edmonton, and the youth pastor of that church in First Assembly in Calgary, he found me, was like, hey, I've been looking for you. Like, I'm about to plant a campus. Do you want to take my job? And I was like, the prayer worked. This is amazing. And so then shortly after that, I started working there as a part-time junior high pastor, worked at a golf course, and was there for 11 years until the Lord, what he moved me on with my family to Yellowknife, just as in a very recent season.
Tell us the story about Yellowknife. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have lots of questions about Yellowknife generally, but how did Yellowknife come on your radar? I'm sure there was a degree of comfort for yourself when you're serving at First Assembly in Calgary. And so I know you talked about the church planting, but when did Yellowknife kind of come on the radar?
Yeah, great question. So the day that I got hired was Tuesday, third week of December, 2012. Again, the goal was to plant a church because they were planting churches. Again, as I already said, it's been a part of my history. So got the job on Tuesday. The Wednesday, next day, had another one of those moments similar to when God spoke to me at that party, just super clear. James, I love new life. I love new churches. I love new kids, so to speak. However, I just want you to be one that sticks with the weary mother, was the line. I was like, what? I'm like, First Assembly's lit. What are you talking about? It's thriving right now. The next day, I get a call. Hey, the lead pastor resigned. Do you still want the job? And I'm like, oh, I see what I'm getting myself into now, which was, in short, several years of absolute chaos. The church had about 60 staff at that time, with all of the 8 church kind of plants, campuses, satellite churches. And all of those pretty much shut down except one. That 60 staff that I knew and kind of came to partner with, most of them left by the time I resigned. There was only 3 of us from the people that I started with. You name the church dysfunction, we kind of lived through it. Multiple pay cuts, layoffs, just unhealth in the church, church splits, like you name it, it happened. And what kept me there, because I wanted to leave many times and had opportunities to leave. But every time those opportunities came, just prayed, and the Lord said, no, stay. I've called you to the weary mother. And that kind of what it means to me was that church, First Assembly, it's a mothering church. So it's almost 100 years old. It's planted a ton of churches. It's kind of been kind of the mother in the city, at least within the Pentecostal world. It's a silly name, First Assembly, but it was literally the first gathering of Pentecostal believers in the early 1900s. So it was thriving at some point, but then it became very weary through all of the turmoil that it was going through, which then our lead pastor came about a year later, and he did a work in the spirit, a mammoth of a job to get it healthy again, to stabilize it. And fast forward 11 years to this past November, 2023, we're celebrating like crazy at our AGM. We went through COVID, and from kind of 2022 to 2023, in about a little 2-year time span, the church went from 1,000 to 3,000, went from like $3 million in general giving to over 10, went from 14 staff to over 60. Not that numerical, numbers are the only sign of health, but they are a sign of health. And I'm sitting in our AGM celebrating. Again, I wasn't looking to leave. I'm like, we made it, God, this is amazing.
And as someone that experienced a lot of the turmoil.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is awesome. But then I'm sitting there and kind of have another one of those really clear God moments. I'm like, oh, Lord, this isn't the weary mother anymore. Like,
Wow.
is that what you still want me to do, to serve? And I'm kind of wrestling because I'm like, oh, I don't want to leave, but I do want to be obedient. So left it for a month and a bit, talking to my wife January 15th of this year, 2024. And what should we do? Her name's Karina. What should we do, Karina? Want to be obedient. January 16th, get a text from one of our intercessors saying, James, and again, this intercessor had no idea what we're kind of wrestling with. James, you're at a crossroads, the Lord says. Look at the ancient paths. Look which way is a good way to go. Then go. The Lord's leading you. Don't overcomplicate it. So I'm like, okay, I don't really know what that means. But then a week later, got another prophetic word from another friend. He said, James, in the next season, the Lord's going to use you to build families around tables. Some people build organizations. God's going to use you to build families. I'm like, okay. And that's always been my DNA flow. Again, small town community church. We really spent a lot of time together in the nitty gritty of discipleship, doing family. So I'm like, okay, Lord, you're speaking. But then the following week, February 4th, I'm hosting the service. My pastor's preaching, and I see him on his knees in worship. I'm like, and not that he's not an emotional guy, but not often do I see him on his knees in worship. I'm like, oh man, God must be speaking to him. It's going to be a sermon today. Let's go. So then I finish hosting. He gets up and he's like, well, church, I don't normally do this, but James, I got a word for you. And what that word was, in essence, was kind of a few things. Like, James, in this next season, God's going to use you to multiply. He's going to use you to plow ground. You've been burying yourself deep into the heart of God, and he honors you for it. It's been lonely. It's been dark some days, but he honors you for it, and dreams in your heart are about to spring up. It's a new season. Behold, I do a new thing. So I'm like, okay, like, get these 3 prophetic words in a row, all within 3 weeks. I'm like, all right, Lord, you're doing something. So what is it? And then that kind of dreams in your heart language. I'm like, okay, some of the dreams in my heart, like, we started a ministry school there in 2019 and had a couple hundred people go through it, just a year program. It wasn't seminary, it wasn't Sunday school. Our slogan was, it's somewhere between Sunday school and seminary. So it was reaching kind of that 80% that aren't necessarily going to go to a YWAM or Bible college or this, that, and the other. And we were able to raise up quite a few people passionate about ministry within the local church, also outside of the local church. So the dream in my heart, because of that word the Lord gave me to the weary mother, was to take with 3 to 5 of these students to some of these rural towns around Calgary, that we would get calls quite often of like, hey, do you know any people that would be willing to be kids ministry or youth, or even to leading a church? Just because, again, people kind of heard about the reputation for Assembly being able to raise up ministers. So I'm like, sweet, like, yes, but most of the people don't want to leave Calgary. They want to stay, because the narrative now coming out of Bible college is like, how can I get on staff at a big church with benefits, a team, good salary, and flexibility? Not kind of to that ancient paths language that was one of the prophetic words. Back in the day, the peak move in Christianity was, here I am, Lord, send me. I'll go anywhere. I'll sell my house and I'll go to the nations. Acts 1:8, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth.
The missionary call.
Yeah, but now it's kind of like, and I get it why denominations focus on city centers, because that's where most of the people are, this, that, and the other. I understand that. And if you're called to a large church, great, bless you. But the narrative today is not what it used to be. Go. It's more so stay. Let's focus on Jerusalem. Focus on our cities, kind of thing.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with James Clarence in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about the Pastorate, which is strengthening pastors for the renewal of the church in Canada. Being a pastor is often marked by loneliness, weariness, and confusion, but there is hope. The pastorate believes that healthy pastors lead to healthy churches, which bring transformations to towns, cities, provinces, and territories. The pastorate exists to see pastors filled with hope, connected in friendship, and equipped to lead resilient churches that shape the future of Canada. The pastorate seeks to serve pastors through cohorts, podcasts, and gatherings. If you would like to learn more about the pastorate, you can visit thepastorate.ca. And now back to my interview with James Clarence.
So the dream was to be able to take some of these students to these towns and go with them, kind of help set them in as leaders. Because I'd say to them, it's like, hey, do you think you're going to be able to afford a house in Calgary? You know, you're in your 20s and you got debt from school. Like, you know where you can afford a house? Nan. Right. And not only can you go revitalize a church with, some 70-year-old pastor, if they still have a pastor, you could go revitalize a church. You could go revitalize a town. Because again, growing up in a small town, a pastor's they're still oftentimes respected from what I can gather. Again, that small town feel, they know everybody. They're not just a pastor of the church. They're kind of a pastor of the town. And you could have open doors to so many different things. Like, you want to start a youth center. Each mayor is like, whoa, how can we like keep our youth here and not have everybody just migrate to the cities? Like, if you want to work with, the DARE or the police, like DARE board, like helping with, people struggling with addictions. Like, there's so many open doors for pastors in small towns, more than I would say a city. Like, if I needed to meet with the mayor of Calgary, I'm never going to get that meeting. But in a small town, I could have that meeting in a week if I wanted to. So I'm like, guys, we could go serve these towns and revitalize not just a church, but Lord willing, a town. So that was the dream, but nobody wanted to go. So part of our church's history was it was a very much ascending church, but we were getting healthy. So I'm like, how do we get back to that ascending church? So get those 3 prophetic words, go to our district conference the next week, and the leadership gets up and says, hey, Alberta, we've got a bit of a problem. Our district is Alberta Northwest Territories. There's 8 churches in the Northwest Territories, and none of them have pastors. There's a Bible college that is sitting empty. There's parsonages, places for the pastor to live. There's sheep, but just no shepherds. And as we're listening to that, my pastor leans over me and says, hey, let's pay attention to this. Let's see if we can send some leaders up there, or a missions team or something like that, maybe help run a camp or whatever. I'm like, okay, never thought about the Northwest Territories in my life, but sure, my pastor's giving me some instructions. You got it. Went away on vacation the next week. I started thinking about it. I'm like, send teams to who? There's nobody up there. Like, who's going to host us? Who's going to plan the ministry? Who's going to, organize the trip? And then for the next 5 nights in a row, I'm on a cruise in the Caribbean with my wife. And I start having dreams about the North, about the Arctic and subarctic, waking up in the middle of the night, thinking about, what could God do there? What's the potential up there? The need up there? And through those dreams, the Lord was like, James, this is the weary mother I want you to go serve. I'm like, okay, better talk to my wife about this. Because again, we weren't looking to leave, and we had an incredible community there. So I'm like, babe, do you love me? She's like, yeah. Do you love the Lord? Yeah. What would you think about our family moving to the Northwest Territories to serve? And she's like, I'm going to need an angel to show up in my bed to convince me of that. But over, the rest of that trip, we just sensed the peace of God on it. And that kind of gave us a green light to go and start having a few other conversations as kind of checkpoints along the way from people we trusted. So we started with my family first, because my dad had actually done a ton of ministry up there over the years, because he grew up in South Africa and was a person of color and went through apartheid. So he's always at heart for the indigenous people of our nation, and done a ton of counseling with different nations up there, and ministered at a bunch of those churches that were without a pastor. So talked with my parents, and they loved it, sensed the Lord on it. Then I'm like, okay, next up, talk to my pastor about it. And when all of the church was kind of going very chaotic. He came to me and was like, James, if you ever want to plant a church, just don't blindside me by it. Just give me a heads up and I will bless you out. So sat him down. I was like, hey, you kind of gave me this prophetic word, pretty intense.
Yeah.
I'm like, did you have any more thoughts on that? He's like, no, man, honestly. He's like, I didn't even know what I was going to say until I was halfway up the stairs. It was like one of those moments where the Lord arrested me and said, get up there. You have a word for James. If you don't get up, you're being disobedient.
Wow.
So he's like, I don't even know what it says. I'm like, well, this is what you said. I transcribed the word. Any thoughts? He's like, no, I was just thinking about sending missions teams up there. I'm like, okay, well, you kind of gave me this nudge to pay attention to the need in the north. Did you have any more thoughts on that? He's like, no, I was just thinking about sending up missions teams. I'm like, okay, well, this is a crazy idea, and I haven't talked to anybody about it apart from family, and I haven't knocked on any doors or anything like that. But years ago, you said if I was going to plant a church to bring you into it from the ground floor, it's not that, but what would you think about sending us as a church to go serve the need in the north? And surprise, he's like, seriously? But as we began to talk, the Spirit of God came into the restaurant, and all the kind of thoughts, ideas, things that we could do up there that I had thought about, he started listing off. So we could do this, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this. And he's like, you know what? Let me call the district, because that weekend I was getting ordained at our church, which then enables me to be a lead pastor at a Pentecostal church. And he's like, let's set up a meeting with our district leader, and let's tell him about this. So that was kind of Wednesday. This was happening on Saturday. So sit down, share the same kind of story with him. He takes it back to the team, excited. The team at the district loves it. Kind of the guy heading up the revitalization of the north for the district, because that's their main initiative this year, calls me, hey, send your resume. There's a church in Yellowknife. I'm meeting with the board on Monday, because I got, met with the district on my pastor on Wednesday, Saturday, the district leadership. Monday, he was meeting with the board, presented our names to the board, and then interviewed about a week and a bit later. And then on the second interview, they verbally offered us the job. And then in our denomination, you vote. So came up beginning of May, or like end of April, beginning of May. There's 39 members at the church. 38 of them were there, and they all voted yes. And then May 20th, Pentecost Sunday, was my last Sunday at First Assembly. And they sent us off and blessed us immensely out to go serve the need in the north, which, again, just speaking on behalf of our denomination, there's a lot of need. But I think also holistically, because, again, denominations, they oftentimes, again, focus on people centers, the large churches, resourcing that. And not everybody wants to move to -40 for several months and darkness. So there oftentimes, and there's good people up here, so don't hear what I'm not saying. There's good people in a lot of churches, but at least within our tribe, not everybody wants to go up there. I'll just say that. So to be able to say yes as a church, the heart was like, could this kind of help us propel becoming a sending church again, First Assembly, but then also for our district? Could this also rewrite an old narrative, reblaze an ancient path, rekindle a vision that our church, our denomination had, which was sending, to go to do literally the ends of the earth. Like, it doesn't get more end of the earth than the Northwest Territories from Jerusalem.
Right?
Could we reinvigorate another story of this generation going? So that's kind of been where it's at. And what we're working on is obviously the church here, Cornerstone Church, in Yellowknife, obviously getting to know them, build rapport, just simply, they haven't had a pastor in a couple of years. So just literally, caring for the flock, but also kind of meeting with other lay members of, like, lay ministers of those other churches, people on boards, trying to get together, building a cohort to say, hey, how could we work on some things together to help kind of get all of these churches restarted, partnered with our district? So that's kind of where it's at now. I, again, moved up, end of May. And then my family just moved up in September, and we're just getting settled in and loving it. Yellowknife, not a lot of people think about it. They just think, oh, it's just winter all the time. It's like, no, it's actually got 4 beautiful seasons. And yeah, it's cold right now and our fall's almost done, but it's an amazing city and not what I anticipated. Again, thinking about the North, thought primarily indigenous, which the Northwest Territories is 53% indigenous people. But there's a huge migration of people from other countries to Yellowknife because they can get really good jobs higher up a lot faster and good paying jobs. So our congregation is 50% African, 20% kind of Southeast Asia, either the Philippines or India, 20% indigenous, and then 10% Caucasians. And not what I anticipated. The board is all from Africa, but they're amazing. And there was no but in there. They're just straight up amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And they think in a way that, no offense to us Caucasians in Canada, but they think in a whole nother way around church, around involvement, around partnership, around, some of that apostolic ministry of sending, of raising up. They think evangelism like nobody's business. I think, again, the narrative is flipped where, Canada and America used to send people. Now, although those nations are sending to Canada.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yo, let's do it together. Come on. Like just fully learning from them on how to do ministry. Cause they've actually, to my surprise, built a really healthy church. Again, when I heard about the North, I'm like, oh, there's going to be a lot of need. And I've been to some of the other churches that either close their doors or are in that spot of 15 people hanging on by a thread. But this one has actually been well taken care of by the board, and they are absolutely incredible. Like, the minimum education is a master's degree on this board, and I'm like, I got a fake degree from some Bible college in the States. Like, I'm like learning from these people, so it's been incredible. So just figuring out ministry in the North. How can we serve the people? Because there is a lot of need. So
yeah, a couple of things come to mind. One is just the full circle reality of thinking back, a question I asked you earlier about, that moment where a preacher pointed you out and said, hey, the Lord has plans in store for your life. And then the moment where then, a pastor that you trust, who you'd been really through a church war with in many ways, he's moved to tears in a worship gathering, stands up, has another word over your life. And now you are leading this church in Yellowknife. Just talk to our listeners about listening to the voice of God, listening to God through other people, the process of discerning that, but also thinking about yourself and the maturation from, the James in the back row to the James open to at least God of having you in a heart posture to say, yeah, okay, if you want me to go to the North, I'll go to the North, Lord.
Yeah. So my mom and dad always had a saying, trust and obey, for there's no other way. Trust in the Lord. And I think it was an old hymn too, but from my upbringing, that was always kind of drilled in a loving way into my head. Like, there's no better place, James, than to be in the center of God's will. There's no better place. You could be in Tuktoyaktuk, which is way up on the Arctic coast. You could be there, but if it's the center of God's will, you will be the most satisfied and fulfilled than in whatever, some sweet, I'm like, well, Lord, why couldn't you have called me to Hawaii? That would have been awesome. But if it's not the center of God's will, I would not be satisfied. I would not be content. So always for me is like, Lord, what are you doing? What do you want me to do? And I haven't been perfect at that by any means. I've certainly disobeyed the Lord lots of my life, and even into my ministry career where I thought James's idea would be better. But he always would prune me, to say the least, and discipline me to the point where I started a ministry school. And then within 2 months, after hiring staff, recruiting 30 students, the hand of leadership got exchanged to somebody else. And I felt like the Lord removed that from me. And his lesson was, James, I wanted to do this with you, not you do this for me. I want to partner with you. I want you to be in step with my spirit. I don't want you to just have to prove or earn or just what you think is logical do just so that you can, feel like you're accomplishing something. I want you to walk with me. Jesus said, I only do what I see the Father doing. And I many times saw what James wanted and just went ahead. But I've just learned over my time, the best thing I can do is hear the Lord. And of course, there's holistic, like we have the scriptures. We know what God's saying and what he's already said and what he's asked us to do, the Great Commission, this, that, and the other. It's like the Apostle Paul going to Asia Minor, and then he gets turned back. He's like, nope, go somewhere else. He was responding to the call, go, and God redirected him. So there's that. But again, that was God doing that. So I think that's where, and I count myself very blessed because not everybody's call was like mine. Not everybody's life. And even my friends now, they're like, dude, you get more prophetic words in public than anybody I know. And I'm like, I don't know. Like anytime there's a prophet in the room, I'm just like hiding because I'm like, no, don't call me out. But it'll just happen very often, which I don't want to say that so that people, either get jealous or wish that was there. God speaks in specific ways to specific people, how he sees fit. And maybe it's just my thick skull that needs a very clear word of the Lord to actually go do something. But I've just learned over the years, again, I just want to hear your voice, God, and partner with what you're doing. And again, through pastors, trusted leaders, through people. Of course, I tested it, took it with a grain of salt. It wasn't gospel truth. I had a number of checkpoints along the way to the fleece, so to speak, of Gideon. All right, is this you? And if you wanted to stop it, God, you could, but I'm just going to keep walking in the way that I think you're calling me, and we'll see where it goes. Like I definitely, it's day by day, step by step, but always with the goal in mind of, Lord, what do you want? What are you saying? How are you saying it? How can I listen? And it's changed in different seasons where I've gotten zero prophetic words. I've just had to, for years, it was silence and solitude, listening prayer. That is what the Lord challenged me, because my Pentecostal experience, maybe a bit more on the charismatic gifts, was certainly alive and well, but my maybe a bit more contemplative flow or stream was lacking. So again, all the trending spiritual disciplines, John Mark Comer, Dallas Willard, all those guys was my bread and butter for the last 6 years, because my Pentecostal experience kind of took me to a point and I needed to grow in another way, learn from another stream. But then bringing those together where I can now do both has been the best thing for myself, that I'm so blessed to be able to learn and be able to hear in different ways, through his word, through silence and solitude, through the charismatic, just again, focusing on hearing his voice.
James, as we close, I was wondering if you could just share some things that you're hopeful about and that our listeners and myself, we can be praying for you about.
Yeah. One of the things, and again, maybe some of you listening have heard this again, and I apologize for leaning towards my roots and history in the Pentecostal church, but there's been a ton of prophetic words, one about Canada, two also about the North. Billy, and this was one of the first things that a couple of years ago that kind of, in some sense, alerted me to maybe the North. Billy Graham's son or grandson, Will, went up to the Northwest Territories and took a team. A friend of mine went up with him, and he came back and was like, man, Will told me about a prophetic word his grandfather gave, I think it is. And what it was the next great awakening. And he said this in the 70s. I went and looked it up. The next great awakening is going to come through reconciliation with the indigenous people. So that kind of sparked my interest a couple of years ago. But more than just the North, like the destiny that God has on the capital C church in Canada. There was another guy named Youngie Cho. He pastored the largest church in the world, Yodio Full Gospel in South Korea. And the Lord in the 90s told him to come to Canada. And he took a Greyhound across the nation. And God spoke to him, I believe it was in Winnipeg, and said to him, Canada, notice something. Canada's the only nation in the world with a flag on it. And the Lord spoke to him, was like, this nation will be like the leaves for the healing of the nations, referencing the verse in Revelation 21, I believe. The church in Canada, I think what God's going to do in the north, reconciliation with the indigenous peoples of our nation, I think God's going to do something absolutely incredible in our nation for the global church. So I think the prayer is, how can, obviously, the ministry up here, obviously all of the other churches, obviously all of the churches in Canada, how can we pay attention to what God's doing and step into, I think, our calling? Because one thing you mentioned before when we were chatting was like, yeah, we kind of listen to what's going on in the States or Australia or the UK, but I'm like, it's Canada's time. And why are we, losing some of our best people to somewhere else? Like, why are we not raising up people from within? Why do we have to go get trained elsewhere? And I know I went and got trained elsewhere, so I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but hear my heart. I'm like, we need to see that in Canada. We need to see ministry schools, Bible colleges, seminaries, churches, raising up people from within for Canada, so that, again, we can actually step into what God has for us. And we got to stop the tall poppy syndrome. We got to stop the being the little brother of America, living in its shadow. We got to start stepping into the destiny that God has by going after heart and soul what he's spoken over our nation. So I think that is my prayer since I was, 16 and the Lord spoke to me about ministry. I'm like, I believe, like, again, in that season of just being alone, just speak to me about this nation. Like, I believe that Canada has a role to play, and that's just what I'm praying and believing for up here, down south, all over the nation, from sea to shining sea. So that's kind of been my prayer. So if you could pray for that, pray for revival, that'd be awesome.
Amen. Well, James, thanks for joining and being part of the Sowers. Well, I'm sure you would agree that there is so much from my conversation with James that could be applied as this episode's action step. The thing that I want to focus on, however, is simply inviting you to the question of, what is God inviting you into in this next season? Something that I was so impacted by with James was his openness to God and to God's Spirit directing him in the way that he should go. And the imagination, as you heard in his story, of going to the north in the early days, it was never something he could have imagined. But he opened himself up to whatever God would have for him, and he followed God's will in his life. And so what is God inviting you into in this next season? Maybe this thing is already on the radar, or maybe it is yet unknown. But again, I want to invite you after this episode today to really give some time and consideration to what is God inviting you into. It may be staying where you currently are, or maybe there's something that God's laying on your heart through this podcast for your future. As always, thanks for listening to this episode of The Sowers. Why don't you go ahead and share this episode with someone that you believe it would be an encouragement to. And now, friends, as we go, here is a clip from the conversation that will be released next week with Tyler Wigg Stevenson of St. George's Grange Park in Toronto, Ontario.
If it's God who gives the growth, and each of us gets to show up at different phases, then you've got to do the stuff that keeps you connected to God and that honors your fundamental commitments, the covenants that you've entered into. If you're married, if you've had children, as a disciple, the commitments of your baptism, right? These primary commitments. Because I think a lot of us are tempted to imagine that ministry should come at the expense of those things. And it's like, that's just not how God works. Why would God do that? Why would God say, do these things, and then say like, oh no, I need you to destroy them so I can do this other thing? Like, no, God. Like, God doesn't need to destroy my life for his church to flourish in Toronto. So yeah, it's hard work. Like, yeah, there's sweat and blood and tears and all that.